lecture by Professor Wolfgang Knöbl. He asked just while we were coming down the stairs if the lecture should be in German or in English. And looking at the audience, I've decided it should be in English. So, but I think it's the same for Wolfgang, so it doesn't matter. He's perfectly bilingual, and he's perfectly bilingual, or trilingual actually, French as well, but bilingual because Wolfgang has had a biography between Germany and the US. He has lived in the US, worked on the US, and he and I go back a long way. We were both assistants together at the Free University, so we know each other for many, many years. When he was at the North America Institute of the university. So Wolfgang has been both in sociology and in a regional studies institute. He is the director currently of the Hamburg Institute for Social Research, which many of you will know. He is also a guest professor, a visiting professor at the Leuphana University in Lüneburg. He has been a fellow at the Max Weber Center in Erfurt and at the Freiburg Institute of Advanced Studies in FRIAS in Freiburg. But before that, he was a professor at Göttingen at the Sociology Institute, where he had a long innings. Most of you who know his work will know him either as a social theorist, who has published not only on the history of sociology, but also a very, very important book for the discipline, especially for all students of the discipline, 20 lectures on social theory, together with Hans Joas. He has done a lot of work in international comparative macro-sociology. He is a historical sociologist with a specialization on the question of violence. And we're going to talk, he's going to talk to us today on the question of how to or how not to explain violence. Just let me mention 3 book titles. I think this one is in English, right? War and Social Thought, I think, is the English title. The German one with Hans Joas is Kriegsverdrängung, ein Problem in der Geschichte der Sozialtheorie. This is a really seminal work in thinking about the way in which sociology, social thought, classical social thought from Hobbes onwards has framed the question of war and of violence. The second theme, which runs through his work on violence, is on states, state formation, the relationship between state formation and the question of violence. The third major theme, but I don't know if that's going to be a theme in tonight's lecture, is Wolfgang's work on modernity. He has looked a lot at classical paradigms of modernization, but then going over to think through Eisenstadt's work on multiple modernities. He has done a lot of writing on the question of modernization and modernity. The German title, I don't know if the book has appeared in English, Spielräume der Modernisierung, das Ende der Eindeutigkeit. I think it's about 10 years ago, 15 years ago almost, that the book came out and had a major impact on the question of how we think about modernity. And last but not least, as I said, Wolfgang has looked at violence in one very particular context, and that has been the US. He has been looking at the question of, is the United States a particularly violent society, and if so, why, and how could we explain this? So with that, welcome to Vienna. It's your first talk at the Institute. We hope it will not be your last visit to us. We can hardly invite you to be a fellow because then you'll have to get yourself somebody else as a director in Hamburg, which may not work. But we very much hope you'll come spend time with us. And we have a project with Ludger Hagedorn and Wolfgang, and that is the common interest that the 2 institutes have in new wars. So we are doing a conference together in May on the question of new wars with Mary Kaldor as our keynote speaker. And of course, we'll send invitations, but it's a continuation of the whole question of how to think about new forms of conflict, war and violence.
So, Shalini, thank you very much for the very, very kind introduction. I'm really glad and proud to be here at the Institute. It's not my first time, but the first time as a speaker, and it's completely false that I'm bilingual. Actually, I don't speak German, I speak Bavarian. I have a very strong accent, and at the same time, I don't speak English, I speak Scottish because I studied in Scotland. So, you know, this bilingual thing is probably not true. In fact, I'm not talking about modernity or wars or so. What I'm going to do is how to explain violence. And I think the question might sound a little bit odd, and therefore I would like to contextualize it a little bit. And let me start this way. Usually, the public, the general public, has a lot of expectations with respect to the social sciences when it comes to the question, can they explain some phenomena? And of course, most of the social scientists would say, yes, of course, we can explain, you know, social inequality or whatever. But in some topics, the question of explanation seems to be a little bit difficult. There are, in fact, some social scientists who would argue you can't explain violence. Violence is a very strange thing. And of course, the expectation of the general public is so strong for simply one reason. And the reason is that we is those people in the Western world, we see violence as a very exceptional thing. It's a kind of an aberration in a rather peaceful industrial and post-industrial society. And since it is so strange, such a strange phenomenon, the general public really wants to know what's going on if people are getting violent. And I think we as social scientists and sociologists, political scientists, ethnologists have to reflect on that, particularly due to the fact that in Western societies, I believe, and there's a book which came out 2016 by a British historian, Richard Bessel, Violence, a Modern Obsession, so is the title, because we have got the feeling the talk about violence becomes stronger and stronger the less violent a society in fact is in Western Europe, or at least in parts of Western Europe. So as Bessel says, there's a kind of an obsession, a modern obsession. And we as social scientists in Western Europe, and most of us come from a rather peaceful middle-class background, should be aware of the fact that we have very strong opinions, very strong judgments, very clear judgments about violence, which other strata of our society and maybe of other people in other parts of the world do not necessarily share. And I think we have to reflect on that. And this brings me to the question how to explain violence. Is it possible to explain it at all? And what are we doing when we are trying to explain violence? So my talk doesn't work. Eine gute Frage. Nee, ich glaube, es ist an. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So, thank you very much. So this will be the structure of my talk. It's structured in 4 parts. The first part is talking about the paradigm shift within research on violence that happened in the 1980s. And I think there are a lot of problems in this paradigm which emerged in the late 1980s and still is very strong right now, at least in the European and US American social sciences. Then I will go to the question, what really do we mean when we try to explain violence? In the third part, I will talk about, is it really good to focus so clearly on violence that the context, the societal context, is left out? This is one of the main features of this research tradition which I'm talking about in the first part. And in the last part, I would like to make a kind of a suggestion, arguing that what needs to be done, at least according to my opinion, is to bring back in institutions. Because if we are not bringing in institutions, we are running into troubles. Okay, this is the structure of my talk, and I would like to start with part one now. Okay. Now, the traditional research on violence, which started in sociology, I would say around 1920 or so, and had a very strong heritage that lasted until the 1980s, usually focused very much on the causes of violence. What are the ideological, what are the cultural, what are the religious, what are the political causes of violence? How does social inequality cause violence? How does poverty cause violence? If you are asking these kind of questions, it is immediately clear, I think, that you are not, as a researcher, interested in violence in itself, you are interested in the causes of violence. So in this long research tradition, and it was a very successful research tradition, the strange thing happened that all the researchers, in fact, didn't know very much about real violence. They just knew a lot about the causes, ethnological, religious, political causes of violence. Violence in itself became a kind of a black box. And this was the starting point of this so-called new paradigm in violence research, which sometimes is called the phenomenological research tradition, not because Edmund Husserl, the father of phenomenology, played such a big role. Some of the researchers were indeed in the tradition of Husserl, but phenomenological just meant looking into the phenomena in themselves, have a close look at violence. And this was a kind of a research paradigm that emerged in the late 1980s, and it emerged particularly, I would say, in the United States and in Germany. In the United States, some quite famous sociologists carried on this kind of research. Jack Katz, for example, a rather famous sociologist from California, but also Randall Collins. You might know him because some of his books are translated already. And in Germany, scholars and authors such as Jan Philipp Reemtsma, the founder of my institute, by the way, Heinrich Popitz, Trutz von Trotha, they all carried this kind of research. They looked very, very closely into the real thing, into the real violence. And my argument would be that this was actually a new turn, it was a new paradigm, and it was in fact very, very successful. So that a lot of younger scholars went into the same direction and moved on into theorizing the actual violence which is really going on, the bodily, the physical violence, which became a huge topic within sociology, ethnology, I suppose, as well, and political science. And as I said, the tradition, the paradigm, was very successful. And I just would like to mention 3 results which came out of this new paradigm. And I want to be very brief in order not to bore you too long. The first result, I think, is when you are talking about violence, when you are doing research on violence, don't expect that violence is a rational thing, and don't expect that violent acts are usually teleological. So the argument in this research tradition was, of course, sometimes people use violence rationally. You know, sicarios in Latin America kill people, purposeful for money. Or the Holocaust was done purposeful by the Nazis. But most of the time the argument goes, violence is not that rational, violence is not that teleological, violence oftentimes happens right far away from rational deliberations. It's not the utilitarian calculus that drives the violent action. And some of these researchers for example, Jack Katz, who did a lot of work on gang violence in American inner cities, he argued that, for example, when you look into this kind of violence, you see that the gang members, for example, are fascinated by the illegal deeds they are carrying on, that they are seduced by the kind of illegal actions which come about, that violence can be fun as well. So don't expect that in the end, violence is a very rational thing. Most of the time, it is simply not. And another result which came out, and which is quite close to the one I just mentioned, is most of the time, people are not using violence for a long time. Violent acts, this is one of the results of Randall Collins, violent acts are rather short-lived. They happen, and most of the time, people are then withdrawing from the place of violence again. And this, of course, makes it necessary to rethink the question how motives are driving violent acts. Because, and this is the argument of Randall Collins, sometimes you don't see real clear motives in the violent acts. Sometimes people do really use violence in order because it makes fun. And sometimes, and this is one of the famous typologies of Jan Philipp Reemtsma, sometimes violence is autotelic. Violence doesn't have any aim outside of itself. It just wants to destroy, it just wants to kill. There's no purpose in it apart from killing or destroying. So the whole idea that violence is most of the time driven by a kind of rational calculus seems to be obviously wrong when you are looking into everyday violence, even if you are looking into violence of civil wars, or even sometimes in wars itself. So this is the first result. The second result, which came out of this paradigm shift, was that violence in itself is most of the time framed in a symbolic universe. It's not brute and raw violence, which you can observe as a scholar. It's most of the time something which is framed by kind of symbolic ideas which are very important. And again, Jack Katz, in investigating gang violence in American inner cities, clearly showed that you have the kind of understanding of gang members that they are dominating the neighborhood. They are dominating their street. They are dominating their village they are living in. And that means they have this kind of feeling of domination, the possibility to use power, which is in itself an enormous attraction for these gang members. And if this is the case, then it is obviously rather related to the political term of sovereignty. And in this sense, Katz, who knows what he's talking about, sometimes talks about the fascistic spirit of these kinds of gang members, because it is the attraction of being able to dominate a territory which makes violence often so attractive. So again, there's not much of a kind of rational calculus in it. When you look into violence, you have to look very deeply into the symbolic context as well. And the last, and maybe a third point is, as I already said, Randall Collins made the point very, very strongly that although we hate, although we all have fantasies which are very violent, most of the people don't kill. Most of the people don't hurt. Which means, and this is a very, very controversial, but also a very important insight, when you are looking into a violent situation, don't take too much time in looking into motives, better look into situations. It's the situation matter. And it's one of the sayings of Randall Collins, who has argued that motives have to go through the eye of the needle of the situation. It's the situation that often matters. you oftentimes don't find motives in the violent act. And you can see that, for example, in phenomena as massacres, such as Millet, for example, where you have not at the beginning of a massacre the clear intention to kill everybody, but you have this kind of forward panic in which something is going on, a situation escalates, and then ruthless killing is going on. It's rather difficult to find clear-cut motives in the background of these massacres. Now, I think these three results, which I just have mentioned, come basically to the conclusion it's not motives that matter, it's situation. It's the situation which was at the very center of this kind of paradigm, new paradigm that emerged in the 1980s and lasts up until now. So I would guess you are not allowed, I think, or you shouldn't, you're allowed of course, but you shouldn't fall back to previous positions, because this kind of research has rather convincingly showed that a too rational, a too motivational driven approach to violence goes into the wrong direction. Yeah? Now, this is the state of the art, I would say, right now. But, of course, like any paradigm, this new paradigm on research on violence also has a couple of problems. And I just want to mention two in order to situate my comment, which goes on in the next three parts. The first problem of this kind of research, I think, can be called under the heading, or can be named under the heading, a kind of pornography of violence. I mean, the question is, what are you doing as a researcher when you are just looking into the violent act? You are looking and focusing closer and closer to the violent act. And in the end, probably a massacre in Rwanda is not very different to the Holocaust or to a gang shooting maybe somewhere else. The closer you look, the less context you are getting into the picture that you have as a researcher. And in some sense, some of the researchers who really are in this paradigm, I think, came close to the danger of writing a kind of pornography of violence, which is attractive, because people, as far as they want to see sexuality, like in pornography, in real pornography, they are oftentimes very much attracted to violence as well. And sex sells, but violence, as we know, sells as well. And this, I think, is one of the problems of this kind of research. But there's a bigger one, a bigger problem. And I think this is actually just much more to be stressed. The second problem, I think, is that using this kind of close focus on violence, the danger of positivism is there. If you don't have any theoretical questions, if you are just looking closely to the violent act, you end up in simple descriptions. You describe massacres, you describe war, you describe civil war, but you lose in some sense the rather larger original sociological, maybe middle-range questions. Where is the larger context of a massacre? Where is the larger context of a shootout? Where is the larger context of a wife beating? You are losing that. And in this sense, of course, some of the people who are doing this kind of research have got the feeling that there's a kind of dead end going on. We are looking too much into the violence in itself, and we are losing the context. And I think right now you can see that some of those who are within the paradigm, within the new paradigm, are trying to get out and are trying to create new terms in order to get back to the macro level again. And I will talk about that in the third part of my talk. They are creating topics such as spaces of violence or markets of violence as terms that promise to close the link between the micro level of violence and the greater macro level. But I will talk about that after my second part. So the whole argument basically is you have this rather successful research paradigm, but you have also a lot of questions which are coming up, which might create some doubt whether this research paradigm is really the best one we can have. Okay. What is the explanation of action? Now, this is a rather important point, and it seems to me that this is a kind of detour of my talk, but I think it's necessary in order to understand what is going on right now within violence research, or within research on violence. Okay, when we look into violence and we believe that motives are a problematic topic in order to explain violence, this is the argument of the new paradigm, then you have to be aware that usually this runs against the wisdom of sociology. This runs against the wisdom of Max Weber, for example, because Max Weber usually argued you can explain action, and you do it best by looking into the motive of actors. But the new paradigm says motives are not that important. It's the situation which matters. So how are we to deal with this kind of contradiction? What's going on here? And what I would like to do is to argue that there is a kind of an older research tradition within sociology, not within violence research, but within sociology, within ethnography, within ethnology, which argues the following way. The argument is as follows. When we want to try to explain an action, motives, in fact, don't help. Why is that the case? It's the case because most of the time actors are not very much aware of their motives. Motives change rather quickly. Only when the action stops and people are looking back to their actions, then they are probably able to say, well, this was probably my motive. That's why I did this. But in fact, during the action, motives are oftentimes very unclear. They are shifting. They are not very precise. They are usually most of the time rationalized, etc., etc. And if this is the case, and this would be my argument, then, of course, it's not the motif and the motives which are most important to look at, but it is the situation. It is situated action which matters, not motives. Now, if that is true, then you could argue when you are looking into violence, for example, don't look at the perpetrator. Don't look at the criminal. Don't look at the Nazi. Look at the situation in which particular people are doing their cruel or oftentimes violent deeds. Because not every Nazi, as we know, killed, but there are many, many situations in which killing obviously happened. So there's a kind of ethnographic argument, an ethnological and also sociological argument, which says it's not so important to focus on how questions, but look at why questions. This is the old paradigm. But the new paradigm should say it's not so important to look into why questions, to these motives, better look at how people really did their deeds. This is much more important. And the argument basically is get away from motive and go back into the situation. There is the situated interaction, there is the situated violence, and we want to get there in order to explain what is going on. Now, if that is common sense within the new paradigm, then you could make a very radical argument. You can draw a radical conclusion. And the conclusion is as follows, and the conclusion was, I think, most clearly articulated by one of the German historians who are in this paradigm, by Barbarowski, European on Eastern Europe, when you are looking into Stalinism, when you are looking into Islamist violence, ideology doesn't matter. People always explain something, but what they are doing is they're using violence. In the end, they are rationalizing their deeds, saying, well, it was religion or it was communism or whatever, but it's not more than brute violence. This is one of the most radical conclusions you can draw when you really believe that it's not motives that matter, but the situation. And my question would be here, is that a really sensible, a rational position? And my argument would be, it's probably not. It's probably not for the simple reason that even if people are in the situation, and even if people are not motivated by clear motives, motives still are there. They are unarticulated, they are shifting, they are just parts and pieces of motives of anti-Semitism, let's say, but they are not nothing. They are there. And if that is the case, then of course a social scientist, when he or she is doing research on violence, should at least take into the consideration these bits and pieces of shifting motives which are around. Because if you are not doing that, you are really ending in this kind of positivism, and you are ending in a very narrow description of the violent act, and then the Holocaust and Stalinism and Rwanda, everything looks the same. And that, I think, is not a very useful and not a very fruitful position. Okay. The point is, and there I will end this part of my talk, the point is that if you are doing that, you are still in the position to look into the wider context of the violent act. You can't escape it. Even if the situation is a thing that matters most, you have to situate your situation in a broader context. If you are not doing that, you are losing the specificity of your historical case. So although there are good arguments from this research on violence to look into the situation, to repeat it again, it makes much sense to contextualize the situation again. Now, this might look a little bit commonsensical and not very innovative, but in fact, when you look into the research which is being done right now, you see very often that this is not done any longer. So there's a problem, obviously. You have to contextualize your situation again. And this brings me to my third part. I already mentioned at the end of my second part, of my first part, that obviously the problems within the new paradigm, that the link between the micro level of violence and the larger societal context between the macro level is not made any longer. And some of the researchers therefore try to introduce new terms, such as markets of violence and such as spaces of violence, because this is a kind of macro structure, or at least not a microstructure, which might be able to link the micro level and the macro level. Now, what does it mean if one uses these kinds of terms, markets of violence and spaces of violence? Before I come to these two terms, let me introduce one of the arguments of Paul Ricoeur, the French philosopher, who wrote a rather important book, I think it was in the 1980s, on metaphors, on living and dead metaphors. And the argument of Paul Ricoeur, and that's why I introduce him here at this point, is social sciences and history are not in a position to get away from metaphorical language. Sometimes you need metaphors. sometimes metaphors are very important to explain things. Metaphors can help in explaining a rather strange phenomenon by putting it out from this strange context into a new one, and by doing so, you immediately or suddenly understand it. Basically, a metaphor is a kind of translation. Something unknown is drawn into a familiar context, and by doing so, you understand it better than before. Now, the argument of Ricoeur, and I make it very simple, of course. The argument of Ricoeur is he distinguishes between living metaphors and dead metaphors. Dead metaphors are those metaphors which are used by researchers or by lay people, which have forgotten the original context. You use a metaphor without thinking what it really means. You don't know any longer why you used it at all. This is a dead metaphor. A living metaphor is one which makes explicit why you use it. You are aware why you use it. And by doing so, there's a kind of translation process going on which helps you to understand a particular kind of phenomenon. Why this excursion to Paul Ricoeur and his book on metaphors? My argument is that within the new paradigm, new terms have been introduced. Markets of violence and spaces of violence. And I believe that these topics, these terms, are very close to dead metaphors. They are used without reflecting what is going on. And I just want to explain it a little bit. Markets of violence as a term was used by German anthropologists in the 1990s in order to describe the civil war situation in parts of Africa. I think it was Georg Elwert who introduced the term. It was a very rational choice, construction, I believe, anyway, but the argument was there are regions in parts of Africa in which the normal economy has broken down so that the use of violence has become a rational means of making a living. There's no real economy any longer. You use your weapon in order to threaten people, in order to blackmail people, in order, just to rob people. So, and the violent way of life has become a kind of normal thing. Therefore, he's talking about markets of violence. Now, my argument here would be the use of this kind of metaphor, I would say, is in some sense highly problematic. Because although the term market of violence sounds really good, the closeness to the original economic idea of a market is not there. I mean, is it really the case that for a long time in Africa, people can really rationally calculate when they are using violence? Is there a price mechanism in this market? How does it work? Is there a hidden hand in this kind of market? My argument simply would be that markets of violence, and this is used very, very often, although in the publications of my own institute, I have to say, are oftentimes not very much reflected upon. And they are used as, I would say, as a dead metaphor. They sound good, and there seems to be a kind of understanding between everyone, but the real context of an economic market is not reflected about any longer. And this makes the term market of violence rather problematic. And I think it's not too different to the term spaces of violence. Again, I think it was rational to introduce these terms, to stress it again, to emphasize it again, because by using these terms, there is a kind of a chance to link the micro and the macro level. But again, spaces of violence, I have grave doubts whether this topic, this term, really explains a lot. It seems to be oftentimes a kind of an essentialization of a space. There is no state somewhere around. So therefore, it's the space, the open space, which seems to create some kind of violence. And in the background, always, or not always, but oftentimes, there's this kind of Hobbesian metaphor. You know, if there's no Leviathan, therefore, you know, people are, you know, using violence as often, as ruthless as they want. If the state is away, there's an open space, and then violence might pop up. Again, I would say, in these historical writings, in these sociological writings, it's oftentimes not the space which seems to explain violence, but it's just institutions. It's just the will of Stalin. It's just the will of Hitler. It's the will of the bureaucracy, etc., which seems to explain the violence. It's not the space in itself. So again, I would argue, in many of the writings on violence in recent times, space was too much essentialized and therefore lost its credibility as a term which really is able to explain something. It is oftentimes a kind of a fake word in order to use an explanation which goes in a completely different direction. And therefore, I think there's something wrong in this kind of argument. Now, if this is the case, then I would argue there's a kind of dilemmatic structure. On the one hand, and this was in the first part of my talk, you have the results which came out of this new paradigm on violence research. Look into the situations. On the other hand, we know that this kind of research tradition was very much positivistically oriented and lost the context, the larger context of a society, for example. Then some people tried to heal that wound, introducing new terms such as markets of violence and spaces of violence. But these, as I would have argued, are only dead metaphors. They are not a solution to a problem. But is there a kind of solution? And probably I cannot offer you a convincing solution, but I try to make at least an argument. And it is an argument that comes out of genocide research and is an argument which is not very much focused on individual violence, but on so-called macro violence, such as civil wars or holocausts or, you know, mass murder. And my argument is the following. My argument is, I think there is within sociology, and I immediately have to admit, it's a rather unclear term as well, there is a term within sociology or the social sciences which is a kind of link per se between the micro level and the macro level. And this is the term of an institution. Institutions are very difficult to define. An institution is a family. Family is an institution. An organization is an institution as well. A marriage is an institution. So I immediately admit that the term institution is rather problematic. But nevertheless, within the social sciences, at least a focus on institutions has one advantage. And the advantage is institutions are linking individual actors with broader societal structures. And if you are doing so, then I would suggest there are, for a sociologist or for a political scientist or anthropologist, I think 5 steps that can be taken in order to explain violent outcomes. And the first argument simply, of course, is bringing institutions back in. What would be the first step? When you are looking into a genocide, when you are looking into a civil war, and we are looking into a war, and these are the cases I'm dealing here in this example, then you really should look into institutions, meaning look into the military, look into militias, look into police forces as those institutions who are usually using violence. And look very carefully at these institutions, because these institutions in normal times might have a rather different logic of action. Military forces do have a different kind of logic than police forces. Police forces do have a different kind of action logic than militias. But in normal times, these institutions do have their logic. Military forces kill people. Police forces try to contain masses or whatever, to survey masses. So they have usually very, very different logics of action. Now, what usually happens in a situation of crisis, in a situation in which a civil war starts, in which a massacre starts, in which a genocide starts, usually it happens that at this point, the logic of the institutions is about to be gone. The difference, the separation between the institutions become blurred. This is the beginning of violence most of the time. In these situations, the police, for example, starts to kill. In these situations, the military, for example, starts to kill also civilians and not only troops, whatever. So for understanding the growth of violence, most of the time it is absolutely crucial to understand what happens to these violent institutions. And my argument basically is that it becomes really dangerous for macro-violence to start if there is really a kind of blurring between the borders of different institutions. Genocides often start at that point, when institutions and the logic of institutions became broken down. This is already the third point of my argument. Why is it so important that borders between institutions are blurred? I think it is important for one thing. If institutional logic doesn't function any longer, if the separation between the institution is blurred, then something happens which really becomes crucial for some actors. Then the level of discretion becomes important. This is the time when some actors, smaller actors, groups, officers, but ordinary men as well, become an enormous power. Because the institutional logic is dissolved, they are the man on the spot who can decide what to do. They can decide who will live and who will die. And most of the time, this kind of institutional arrangement, which happens into a kind of blurring, this is the beginning of mass violence of tremendous extent. Therefore, I think this is very important. And the fifth point, absolutely crucial as well. If you have a blurring of institutions, and if at the same time this blurring of institutions increases the level of discretion for the actors on the ground, and mass violence starts, then there is an enormous feedback mechanism of this violence on the original institutions. When violence really starts in a mass dimension, then the institutions are in danger of dissolving rather quickly. Then this is the situation where different kind of actors, without looking into the logic of their original institution, are often doing the most cruel things. And I think this kind of a model, it's not really a model, should be at least a kind of starting point in order to get from the original paradigm, the paradigm that started in the 1980s and lost contact to the macro level, should be able to be a better starting point than those terms that I just explained, like markets of violence or spaces of violence. And I'm quite sure to stress it again, that the term institution is a rather problematic one. It's not very well and not clearly defined. But I think there are not that many solutions within the social science, at least not within sociology, in order to get to close this link between the micro level of violence and the bigger macro structures. And there I would like to end my talk.
Thanks a lot, Wolfgang. This is a very interesting talk for me for two reasons. One, because as an anthropologist, listening to you, of course, I find myself first taking the step with you into the phenomenological, where the anthropologists played a huge role, and they haven't taken the step into the institutional with you. But what they have done instead is to look at the political economy of violence. So I think there is another way of thinking of the context, which would be the political economy, and that's something I would like to talk to you about. The other point I wanted to make is the political scientists have been measuring violence. So there is a whole quantitative tradition which also is abstracting from context in a way, and I think there is something that one needs to think about because there is an analytical rigor to it, although you and I will have the same problems about the decontextualization. And then one question on gender, where I think we do need to think about the gendered nature of violence. But then, listening to you, I had the feeling, if you're looking at the phenomenology, then you have a moment of exoticization of the violence. Coming back to institutions, you are in a sense almost normalizing the violence. And I think there is a problem there. Like if I was listening to you, I was thinking of Stefan Kuhl's book, for example, where he even calls the institutions which are responsible for the Holocaust as he in fact calls them normal institutions. And the question is, in what sense are these institutions normal? I mean, apart from the fact that I think, and I'd love to hear you on Stefan Kuhl's book, because he is taking the step with you to get into a macro-sociological perspective, trying to explain the Holocaust through the nature of the organizations. But in the last analysis, he comes down to talking about anti-Semitism, Männlichkeitsvorstellungen, etc. So in a way, yes, he takes the step into this direction, and he falls back on motives. And this is where your level of discretion, number 4, also has a lot of room for thinking about motives. So I don't know if in a sense it's setting up a straw man to sort of this question between motives and situations, rather than think of the context as involving both biographies, because that is where also the motives will come from, and situations where the macro and the micro could meet. But this is just because, I mean, sorry to start off with this, but it was a very, very interesting talk for me. I'm going to hand over to you. We can come back to this later. I'm going to give it to Sophie.
Well, thank you for this. I was once myself obsessed with the issue. With the issue of violence, although I cannot really see blood. There is somewhat a disjunction in my mind out of your presentation. Your first level was, let's not try to understand why violence occurred. Let's look at the execution of it, right? That's what. And the thing
was not mine, it was the paradigm.
Okay, fine. Then, and I think that's quite all right. That is, we can fantasize about violence, like you do about sex, and then you can do a lot of things on a human's body, or an animal's body. Then, when you move to this issue of institutions, so if I understand you correctly, you're saying, first of all, the act of violence itself, we should understand in its own terms. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then you can have varieties of inducing violence. And then next to the macro level, what may actually, the situations that may create this, whether one uses the term markets or whatever. As to institutions, the question would be, institutions discipline you, and even institutions that are actually created for violence, like the army, actually discipline the soldiers, right? That is, there are certain things you cannot do. So if we find rampant violence, as we do in many civil war situations, that's because the discipline has broken down. The institutions do not actually work, okay? So institutions are good to contain violence. The dissolution of institutions is bad in terms of violence just getting totally out of hand. Is that not true?
I think I can link the two questions. I've just written, it's not published yet, a review on Kühl's book in the Zeitschrift für Genozidforschung. And I think we are very, very close in reading this book. Stefan Kühl's book is called in German Ganz normale Organisationen, quite normal, ordinary men, ordinary organizations. And what he's looking at is those organizations which executed the Holocaust in Hitler Germany. The point he's making, and this is why I have some difficulties with the book, he uses Niklas Luhmann's organizational sociology of the 1960s in order to explain the Nazi organizations of the 1940s. And this is strange for one particular reason, because Niklas Luhmann's book Struktur und Funktion, formale Organisation, Structure and Function of Formal Organizations, which came out, I think, in 1962 or 1963, has on page 100, I looked it up, the argument, of course, this is Luhmann saying, of course, I'm just looking into this, these kind of smooth running organizations in democracies. Now, what Stefan Kühl does, he uses this kind of organizational sociology in order to impute it on the Holocaust in the 1940s. And my argument would be, well, I don't think that the SS was a quite normal organization. Sorry? It's not about normalcy. No, it's not about normalcy, right. And my argument would be, I think Stefan Kühl made a good point in saying, probably you know that better than I do, that within genocide research, within violence research, organizations have been underestimated and their role have been underestimated. But if you are saying that, you as a sociologist, or me as a sociologist, should not say, well, we have one model of an organization and that's it. What you should doing is you should historicize, you should contextualize, whatever, organizations. And if you are doing that, then I think it is quite clear that the SS is not, a kind of normal organization in the Federal Republic of Germany in the 1960s. And therefore the whole argument, a quite normal organization, seems to be quite off the mark, because I'm completely with you that in the end, in the book, a lot of anti-Semitism comes up, a lot of male behavior comes up, a lot of whatever. So it's not about organization, it's again about motives. And my argument is, you only can avoid that. The dilemmatic structure between motives and situations if you use organizations or institutions, but only if you are able to historicize them. If you are not doing that, you get your argument again wrong. I don't know whether that at least partly explains your question or answers your question. The point by Shalini on gender, I didn't talk about gender at all. I mean, it seems clear to me that most of the macro violence is male violence, obviously. But I think, again, it is helpful to look into institutions, and the gendered order is an institution in different societies. And I think that at least would be a starting point in order to get into the different explanations why, for example, it's the male persons who usually use this kind of violence. Then I think your observation is just brilliant, saying, what I did basically was, by shifting the whole debate on institution, I'm trying to normalize violence again. And I would say probably, yes, you are right. It's again an attempt to normalize it in some sense. And I probably don't have a good answer to your observation. But in the end, I would say, if you want to bring back violence research into the debates of the political scientists, into maybe the debates of the ethnologists, into these kind of middle-range questions, you should go this way. Because just looking into situations and thus exoticizing this kind of violence can't be the future of violence research. Because this, is, I think, is a dead end, unless you believe that by focusing on violence, you are doing this kind of anthropological analysis in the sense of you're talking about the condition of man. You know, the male man, yeah, as a kind of person who is always able to use violence. That is okay if you're doing that, but the gap to empirical research becomes bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think that should be avoided. Therefore, normalization. I admit that.
Can I ask my question?
He's got the mic.
Okay, sorry. I have a conceptual question. I would like to know what your understanding of violence is, because yes, you talk all the time about violence, but I did not understand how this relates, for example, to aggression, to war. I mean, you were mentioning some ideas, but to understand what the issue of normality within that field is, I mean, our understanding of these fundamental concepts has changed over time and time. And your understanding of violence has been shaped by, I mean, events and very unnormal things in the 20th century. At the same time, we are debating conflicts, etc., etc. So what is the current state of debate here in the field of concepts?
Well, the current debate, let me first start. You started with one term, aggression. I think everyone who is in violence research immediately realizes how difficult interdisciplinary work is. I think there's a huge gap, for example, between the social sciences, anthropology, political science, sociology on the one hand, and psychology on the other hand. Because psychologists usually talk, well, not usually, but oftentimes talk about aggression. This is a term which doesn't make much sense for social scientists at all. So in fact, oftentimes we are just not talking to each other, but we are talking, you know, not to each other. That is oftentimes the problem. The second point is how to historicize violence. First of all, I would say I didn't do anything of that, which was my fault. My point is the new paradigm which emerged in the 1980s almost exclusively, even exclusively, focused on physical violence. I think it was a good step at that time, when it was made in the 1980s, to get away from all these huge debates which followed the idea of Johann Galtung and his term of structural violence. Structural violence as a kind of equivalent to social inequality, to injustice or whatever. And I think it was a good step that these new researchers did. Let's focus on real physical violence, because it's different when you're talking about hitting somebody or, giving somebody the feeling that he's not recognized. There's a big difference. But of course, the debate now seems to be, and some German sociologists, Peter Imbusch, for example, are arguing, well, it might be that this kind of exclusive focus on physical violence is maybe a dead end as well. Why? Because why are we not focusing on this kind of psychological violence that happens? Why not talking about mobbing, for example? Why not talking about threatening people, almost by blackmailing people, although it's not violence, but I mean, it's quite close to violence. The point is, I think, I don't believe that we, within sociology at least, have a clear answer to that. The attractiveness of the new paradigm was simply You had a clear focus. It's violence. It's physical violence. That's it. That is your corpus of explanation. That you have to explain. When you are coming to the next point, and this was yours, how are you able to historicize this physical violence? Then you are running in difficulties, of course. I think it should be done, but it is very, very difficult. And we all know that slapping a kid in the 1950s by their parents was not violence. Nowadays, it's violence. Is that what happened in the Middle Ages? Is that equivalent to things that happen nowadays? And oftentimes you can read, even books written by social scientists who are talking about a kind of medieval violence which happens in somewhere in Africa or in Latin America or India. This is no contextualization, no historicization. But you have to do it, but how to do it is, I think, rather difficult. And I don't see right now, actually, maybe in anthropology, but not in sociology, that there's a really big movement towards historicizing the term of physical violence. Of course, once upon a time, there are people who are discussing it, but it's not a current which is moving into one direction.
Okay, so I might have got this wrong, but looking at what you were saying about institutions, it seemed to be very much state against citizens. And I'm wondering, if we're looking at violence going the other way, for example, rebellions, that kind of thing, insurrections and things like that, what kind of institutions can we look at there, where we seem to have violence going the other way, rather than say, your classic kind of Holocaust, it's the state against citizens and things like that. And what happens when it goes the other way?
Yeah, maybe I made a kind of suggestion which is wrong. I mean, it's not top-down. It's not meant top-down. Because when you are talking about institutions, you can, of course, talk about the IRA or so. Yeah. You have this kind of, rebellion armies, terrorist group, you might call them whatever. But I also would agree with people in my own institute who are doing this kind of research. When you are looking into the IRA or the ETA or so, you're talking about institutions, you're talking about organizations, you're talking about hierarchies or whatever. And by looking into these hierarchies, and actually you can do this as well when you're talking about the mafia, and there are very different types of mafias existing in Italy in very, very different structured way. When you look into the kind of violence they use, there are good arguments to assume that it very much depends on their organizational or institutional structure, which of kind of violence they are actually prepared to use. So don't let me be misunderstood. I'm not just talking top-down, I'm also talking about militias. I'm talking about, Bürgerwehren. I'm talking about fascistic groups which, are created from bottom up in order to kill people, for example. And that has nothing to do with the state. Sometimes, of course, there are close links between fascistic groups and the state, but it's not necessarily top-down.
Well, thank you for the inspiring talk. I have a question concerning rationality. You started off by saying that this is one of the paradigms of research on violence, that we have to take into account that it is a non-rational choice or not a rational decision. And you seem to be largely sympathetic with that, I guess. I wasn't really sure in the end about, you on the one hand, you tried to stress the motivational side, obviously, bring back in the motivational side, not just speak about the situation, but about motivation. What does that mean about the question of rationality? And to bring that back, you mentioned this metaphor by Elvert, Georg Elvert, Gewaltmarkt, a market of violence, and you criticized the metaphor as a metaphor. You said it's a dead metaphor. But the reason he used this term Gewaltmarkt was that he wanted to say in certain circumstances, failing states and so on, it is absolutely rational to use violence. So I mean, when criticizing this metaphor, what about this implication that it is a rational choice, and that in that circumstances violence obviously is a rational choice?
First of all, when I may start with the second question, I wouldn't accuse Elvert in using a dead metaphor, because at that time I think he was quite clear what he was doing. But within much of research on violence right now, the metaphor pops up again and again and again, and I would say in this sense it has become a kind of a dead metaphor. Now, the argument which came out from sociology actually very early onwards and was directly directed to Elvert was, we as sociologists, and I think I would support this position as well, we just don't believe that you can establish a kind of social order maybe exclusively based on violent acts. That does not work. Because violence is such a disruptive action that you are not able to foresee the consequences of your deeds and your actions. It's just completely different to a market transaction, you know, at the real market. And therefore, the idea that there's a kind of rationality in large parts of the world, or not in large parts of the world, or in parts of Africa, let's say, that there's a kind of rationality going on between the actors involved, and there's a kind of rational order in which the actors use violence rationally, that seems, according to some of the sociologists, hugely overdrawn. They just don't buy the argument. And I would say, yes, there's probably something true. It's not to say, and I also mentioned the word or the term of the sicarios in Latin America. Of course, you can buy the killing of a person in a Latin American city, and this is a market and it has a price or so. But in fact, it's rather difficult to find many of these situations which really deserve to be called markets of violence. This is the simple maybe argument I would put forward. Now, rationality, and they also said, of course you can have, again, example sicarios, but also you can think about, you know, Hitler or whatever, saying it is our aim and it is our goal to exterminate the European Jews. So that is a rational plan, this is rationality, whatever. And I wouldn't doubt that this is a kind of rationality. Or this is not kind, this is rationality. But the point being made by these researchers is that most of the time, by everyday violence, even in these cases where the level of discretion within mass violence is rather huge, it's not so much about rationality, it's about emotional framing, it's about symbolic framing, it's about many things. People are using violence, not thinking that they would use it. So you have a lot of things which really seem to contradict this high assumption that rationality seems to be the driving force behind violence. And in this respect, I would say these researchers and their results are quite valid, still valid.
Thank you.
What about the weapons, the impact of weapons?
It's a very difficult question. From my own research, I just want to give you an example. It was always the argument, for example, that the United States as a society are such a violent society because, you know, guns are all over the place. And this is probably true. I mean, I think there are guesses that there are about 300 million handguns around the United States. So it's an enormous number. So, of course, the availability of guns is killing people, is killing more people than if, you know, everybody would have a kitchen knife only. But on the other hand, you have strange observations when you look through the history of the United States. For example, what you see before and after the Civil War, 1861 to 1865 in the United States, that after the civil war, the level of violence decreases. And although the number of weapons, just because of the civil war, had increased enormously, so the relationship between violence and weapons, there is a relationship, but it's a rather complex or complicated relationship. And of course, if you have automatic weapons, if you have, bigger guns, whatever, the chances that you are killing a lot of people are getting bigger and bigger. But the existence, of weapons alone is not killing. And I hope I'm not seen now by this remark as a propagandist of the American gun associations. So I just want to say it's more complex than just weapons and violence are very closely related.
Or in Switzerland, where they can
Oh,
have sex
yes.
with their weapons.
Yeah,
Not-
yeah.
I mean, this is an interesting statistic.
Thank you. Let me try to make a rather simple, if not simplistic, point on methodology. It has to do with my background, with some background in economics. So I'm wedded to the idea of models when you get to explain something.
Fair enough.
As a precursor, if I understood you correctly, phenomenology as a methodological viewpoint here is a kind of dead end. It always reminds me of, is that the word that Horatio says to Hamlet, "'Twere to consider too curiously, to consider so, leave everything out." Hamlet looks at the skull of your thing. So this can be excluded as something useful or fruitful. And here my question: did I understand you that with the elements that you presented here in your very inspiring and thought-provoking talk, are there to form what might be called a complete or even a closed model of violence, including, of course, a motivational basis? There is the way to violence starts from motivations. To go back to the Scottish Enlightenment philosophers, it starts from the passions, isn't it? Resentment, hate are the basis, and it depends on how far you go, how far you travel this road, how far you allow yourself to travel this road. So that's the basis. The end, of course, is violent action of some sort, and you need to know what it means, what counts as violent action. And in between there are institutions, and here an offer from the, not an offer, a remark from the economic point of view. An institution is something very abstract. It doesn't have to be tangible. Can be a mindset, can be a mode of education, and so on. These are the things that finally should put together into a closed model, should get us some way towards explaining violence and, again, the economic point of view, having something that is policy relevant. Institutions and the forming of institutions is something very policy relevant. Did I get your point that you're going for a comprehensive picture?
Thank you very much. I think a very good question. Just to your first point, and I think we should take that really seriously. And this is the point I already mentioned in the talk by Randall Collins. We all, I suppose that I'm not an exception, we all hate sometimes. Your colleagues at work, you could kill him or her. Yeah, you could, whatever. He makes you or she makes you so angry, I mean, unbelievable. But most of the time, we don't kill, we don't slap, we don't hurt, whatever. And the argument of Collins, I think, is worthwhile to look at it, saying, when I look into the micro events of violence, I first have to say, not everyone who is angry really, uses violence. This is a real minority. And second, even if it happens, this violence is oftentimes very short. People, slap or hit or whatever, but this is a rather short-term thing. If that is the case, the term motives, which is very much at the background of an actor, does not make that much sense. And I just want to, explain you the logic of his argument, saying the motives don't tell you much. You have to look at the situation. If you don't do that, you'd never understand why some people kill, others don't. So this is the first point. The second point, closed model. I don't think, and I'm a sociologist coming from a very historical background. And there are, of course, some sociologists who are loving model builders. I'm not. I don't believe that we are really able to build models, for example, in this kind of thing. Particularly or not, if that is the case, what you just said, and you're right saying that, if institutions are not only police forces or military forces or militias, but institutions are, this kind of lofty, this kind of liquid things, kind of arrangements of orders, whatever. I don't think that we all that get into one model. I don't believe that. What we could do, for example, and that has been done by some colleagues, and one of the most famous one is the American political scientist and sociologist Stathis Kalivas, who tried, from a rational choice perspective, tried to explain why in the Greek Civil War some people killed and others did. Why in the Greek Civil War some villages were targeted and others were not. I mean, you can build a kind of model why in parts of Greece violence happened, in others not. But in the end, it still leaves the question open, who were these guys who really killed? You can explain why violence happened there, but still you have the problem to explain who was really responsible for this kind of violence, who really did the killing. This is unexplained by this kind of model. And here again you have the question, either you are trying to build a model, then you are quite far away from the violent act, or you look very closely into the violent act, and then the explanation is almost gone. That's a problem. And I think it's a kind of a dilemmatic structure, and I think Shalini is right to point that out. Either you're exoticizing violence, not explaining it any longer, or you're going, as I did, to institutions, trying to explain it, but then there's a very process of normalization going on.
Hello. Thank you for your talk. I think it got me thinking at a number of points that I'm already playing with in my mind. So excuse me if the comment will be a bit long, and I think it will be of productive disagreement.
Okay.
Since I'm also trained as an anthropologist working broadly in social science, so my preference, of course, is for observing the everyday life, and sometimes it also involves violence. Mm-hmm. But I wouldn't say that in my accounts of writing about it that I in any way try to exoticize it. More of trying to say something new about how it operates between people, how people assign it to different groups than themselves. And this then is connected to something that I always found was latent in your talk, but that you never named, namely discourses. Mm-hmm. Because you take motives and institutions, but discourses that would enable violence as well as legitimize it, you never mentioned. And then my second, from a different angle, judging by your points, I think in normalizing violence, aren't you also normalizing institutions that have a monopoly on violence? And I'm very curious about blurring, what you call blurring, because to me, institutions are always blurry. This is how I was trained to think. And I think, is there a degree of blurring? Or if not, is it that you legitimize a certain use of violence against certain groups, which would put you in line with, I mean, it's a dangerous path to go down on, not saying that the modern state is not built on that, but there were rational, I mean, most genocides were rational, calculative organizations based in the state and with economic reasons behind them. So in a sense, what does blurring add to that? Isn't it like putting the blame on the individual soldier, saying discretion caused actually the Holocaust rather than saying there was a calculation. And my third point is, how do you see the relationship between violence and broader processes of biopolitics, which are also based on political and economic calculations, but are more about letting people die or making them live rather than bluntly using the right or non-right to kill them? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'm not so sure whether I can answer your third question, but let's start with the first thing. You said as an anthropologist, when you're doing your research, your fieldwork, you're not in danger of exoticizing violence.
Not that I'm not in danger of it, but more that what my aim is to understand it in relation with broader societal processes and not to present the violent act itself.
True.
So it's not purely phenomenological in that sense.
No, but in this sense, probably you wouldn't be too far away from the methodological or theoretical orientation of Jack Katz, who argued, when I'm looking into violence or into some types of action, I'm not asking why questions, I'm asking how questions. And by doing so, I'm looking into the context, I'm asking why are people behaving like they do. So it seems to be strange maybe, but I would like to understand. And therefore I'm trying to contextualize the whole behavior. And in this sense, you're right, it's not exoticizing any longer. Is that your point?
Why? Because you started with the how and then you snuck in a why. Why do people behave in this way?
No.
I try to look into two things. How do people behave and what are the conditions of possibility of their behaving, of them acting in this way? I don't use behaving because it's psychologizing.
Yeah, let me start again. The traditional research, was on why question. Why do people use violence? Because of social inequality, because of ethnicity, because of religion, because of politics, whatever. The argument by Jack Katz was, why questions and the answer of why questions don't help me. I want to understand how people are getting along in their everyday life, how people sometimes or often use violence. And the, I would say, rather sophisticated argument was of Jack Katz, and he made that rather explicit, that the real guys who are explaining are those who are asking the how questions. It's not the why guys who explain something, but the real, maybe as you, the anthropologist or the ethnographer, who is not asking why question, who just wants to understand what's going on the floor, he or she is the one who really explains. That is a much better explanation. And of course, we are coming here into very deep water with respect to what does explanation really mean. I mean, it's a question of a theory of science, of course, as well. And there are lots of debates about this thing. I just want to say here in your example, the point here is not that you are exoticizing it when you are looking into the broader context as you suggested. My point simply was that the paradigm that started in the late 1980s had such a close look into the violence that it completely forgot that what you obviously did. It forgot to get back in the larger context. That was basically the argument I made. The second one is discourse. Well, of course, I mean, now it depends which kind of discourse term you basically use. Of course, I mean, you can think about a Foucauldian discourse or whatever, and I would say I could go along with that. Yeah, you don't have to use motives, you could also talk about discourses, but in the end I would say within the new paradigm in the 1980s, and maybe this was one of the weaknesses as well, neither motives nor discourses played a big role. And it's probably not that these guys didn't know, the Foucauldian discourse analysis. It was just that it was rather difficult to get into this physical violence in order to theorize this kind of physical violence by discourses. They obviously had difficulties in doing so. And the last point I would like to answer is the blurring of institutions, by saying that I believe that major violence happens if institutions are blurred. I obviously don't want to apologize the leaders of a state or the leaders of the Holocaust who who did the Holocaust, to the officers, whatever. That's not my point. As I said, of course, I'm not blaming those at the level of discretion, although I actually would think these guys are important. We know that from the Holocaust that these guys are most important. We know that from colonialism, the man on the spot, these are the ones who really can make the difference as well. So my point simply is that when you have the top-down look, you have to look at the leaders of the state or the leaders of a police or a military, but don't forget these things which are happening here. And again, I would say when you have the different perspective, the bottom-up perspective, again, the level of discretion should not be disregarded. I think this is important as well. Violence and biopolitics, it's probably too difficult for me to answer. Maybe I don't have a good answer to that.
How would you use this framework to describe or analyze outbreaks of mass communal violence?
Communal violence. Communal violence means in villages, in quarters of big cities. That's wow. I'm coming from the symbolic interactionist, pragmatist tradition of sociology. And one of the trademarks of this kind of tradition was that in the 1960s, when the riots happened in the United States, in the Watts riots, for example, 1966, was it 1966 in Los Angeles? Those guys from the pragmatist or symbolic interactionist perspective first try to make sense of these kinds of riots without, blaming those who used the violence, by arguing it was not rational. It was not irrational either. But in the interactions between the police and the community in Watts, for example, new kinds of pictures, new kinds of ideas, maybe you can even say new kinds of discourses emerged that were not there at that time. And there emerged a kind of discourse, if you want to use this term, a discourse on what happened here was a huge kind of, let's say, injustice by the police because somebody was arrested for minor reasons or so. And then a huge debate started on the spot, debate, not a rational debate, not, that people were talking, but a kind of common understanding emerged within a quarter, within a neighborhood, that there is something completely false in our quarter, in our community. And this, in the end, allowed those actors on the spot to use violence, and they did it rather, I would say, not indiscretionately, and do you say that? Because they targeted rather rationally, but probably rational is the wrong word, rather rationally some buildings and others not. They targeted offices of the police, offices of the state, offices of, which have a kind of official structure, but others not. And in this sense, I would say, there are some things which are rather difficult to explain by using a fixed term of institution, but the research in the 1960s at least established, and now this is an established research tradition, they tried to establish a kind of a social movement as a kind of institution. Now, you probably wouldn't say that the Watts riots were the beginning of a social movement, but at least it was a pre-form of, a kind of social movement. And maybe just one point, which I found rather interesting, most recently, and this brings me directly to your question. Unfortunately, I forgot the author of the book which came out in our publishing house. I think what is completely forgotten right now, and the volume made it quite explicit, sociologists talk about social movements, sociologists talk about institutions, sociologists usually talk about clearly structured things. What they're usually not doing, and was the title of the book, they are not talking about Gewaltmassen, masses of violence. This is a kind of liquid structure, rather difficult for sociologists to understand. But even in this book, people try to get along with institutions, state institutions, bottom-up institutions, in order to explain what's going on if the masses just run, if the masses just begin to act without a clear, structured institutional background.
Ivan.
Just very briefly, the relationship between politics and violence, and when you talked about institutions, and this goes back to Solly Ozel's question, when a Hitler decides, quote unquote, rationally that he wants to exterminate the Jews, the whole state apparatus and every single institution, down to the railway organization, is instrumentalized. And there is no way in this hierarchy, plus the kind of mass psychology of fascism, you know, to quote, the name escapes you now, of course, is in action. So that opens the space then for person X hating neighbor Y to, you know, finally he can do what he or she wants to do. So the institutions can be the legitimate uses of violence, but if the order comes from the top, and you did mention, you know, the top down, I think then the institutions are not what they were made for. Rather, they are perverted into a single goal, which is, you know, I come from former Yugoslavia, when the nationalist leaders, Milosevic, Tudjman, decided to carve up the country. The army, the police were unleashed to do what their politicians said. And that then at the village level, and this goes back to your Greek example, there were places that held out against violence. The three communities would say, we resisted, but when our people came from over the hill, we couldn't avoid it anymore. And so I think that is an interesting way also to address it. Who were those who were able to actually resist?
No, I see that as a comment. I completely agree that should be included into the picture.
Okay, I think we can close the discussion now. But thank you very much, Wolfgang, for a talk which has provoked lots of questions, comments, also disciplinary differences, as well as, I think, questions coming from different theoretical traditions, where there are very many points of intersection, also disagreement, but for a wonderful discussion. And thank you for being here with us this evening.
Thank you.
Diana hat gesagt, es sind jetzt 8 Leute. Ja, die waren 3, aber die sind etwas gewachsen. Ja.
Gehst du jetzt mit? Ja, ja. Das freut mich. Oh, vielen Dank.